Emulators suck. They can be finicky, it can take years until compatibility isn't a noticeable issue, and I hate having to tweak that one setting in Gran Turismo 4 so that this doesn't stay on the screen during every race. That being said, I love emulators, and they play an incredibly important role in media preservation. See, other forms of media don't face the same challenges that video games do when it comes to preservation. MP3s and MP4s are files that can easily be read by essentially any modern computing device. You'd have to have a really shitty potato to have a hard time watching a movie, or even worse, listening to music. It's worth noting that I can watch any film I want on my PSP as long as it's formatted correctly. That device is almost 20 years old now. Unfortunately, games are a special case as they don't function the same way that movies and music do. They're programmed to run within specific digital environments, and if that requirement is not met, you're gonna have a pretty hard time playing that game. Obviously, this presents somewhat of a very annoying obstacle when it comes to preservation. Eventually, all the hardware and physical games you own are going to degrade. You can definitely take steps to help slow the process down, but that doesn't change the fact that it's going to happen someday. You might get lucky and it won't happen during your lifetime, but your discs will eventually rot. It sucks, but thankfully, we have tools to digitally preserve video game history. Emulators are possibly the most important tool to ensure future generations get a proper glimpse into the history of this medium. The sad fact of the matter is that video games are likely one of the worst preserved forms of media, at least when it comes to official means. According to the Video Game History Foundation, approximately 87% of classic video games released in the US are critically endangered. While this does sound like a line out of a nature documentary, it does illustrate a clear issue. Most companies simply don't want to go to the trouble of re-releasing old games. Unless there is significant demand, it's not guaranteed that the process of bringing an old game back to the market will be profitable. There will be costs that involve porting the game to current platforms and marketing. Additionally, some games can prove to be licensing nightmares if they include real-world vehicles, music, and more. If the demand for a game is limited to a niche audience, all of those costs may not make a re-release worth it. This probably isn't a revelation to most of you, but corporations aren't your friend, and they only really care about one particular goal, which is to make money. So we can't expect the industry to make game preservation a priority. I can guarantee that no remaster gets greenlit for any altruistic purpose. In fact, the reason why so many remasters seem like they do the absolute bare minimum is because they're the very definition of a cash grab. This is absolutely not to say that I'm inherently against the concept of remasters. When done properly, remasters can be great at smoothing out the edges of older games and even adding functionality to them. However, it is important to recognize that we can't count on remasters to preserve games. For reasons I have already basically outlined, it's far too unrealistic of an expectation. It's also worth noting that good remasters are rarely the same as the original software they are based upon. They can functionally be different games with different programming quirks. So, the only way to truly experience a game as it was originally released is to experience the original release. As you might have guessed, this is where emulation comes into the picture. Of course, many emulators can have issues when it comes to emulating consoles accurately, but it's the next best option if the original hardware is no longer available for you. Now, the game industry's relationship with emulation is a bit complicated. It's somewhat inaccurate to say that companies hate emulation as a whole. Yes, the actual legal grounds for emulation are a bit shaky and uncertain, but that doesn't equate to emulation being illegal. In fact, game companies utilize emulation regularly to re-release old games. This is usually the case when a company releases a compilation of previous titles. Instead of developing individual ports, it may be more cost-effective to develop an emulator for these games instead. If you ever see anyone ask if a re-release of a game is emulated or a native port, this is why. Emulation is capable of doing a lot, but it doesn't have the same flexibility as games that are programmed to run on up-to-date hardware. However, porting games via emulation can be a lot less time-consuming. This is especially the case if you're developing an emulator for a first-party company that has access to tons of documentation. As you might be able to guess, ports that rely on emulation often turn out to be lower quality than native ports. However, emulators can still do plenty of neat things when enough work is put into them. A lot of ports that utilize emulation are simply made under strict time constraints, which can make the final product underwhelming. A native port doesn't necessarily always indicate a good remaster. Do I have to remind everyone of the travesty that was the Silent Hill HD collection? That being said, the main thing to take away from this section of the video is that game companies don't inherently hate emulation. It's especially in the interest of third parties who ensure that emulation is an option available to them if they want to re-release their old titles. Emulators can be a very powerful tool that benefits everyone, and that's where the issue lies for corporations. What game companies hate is unofficial emulation. They see emulators like Dolphin or PCSX2 as tools primarily used to aid piracy, and to be fair to them, they may not be entirely incorrect. Sure, you can say that you only use ROMs from games that you own and have dumped. You may even be able to prove this, but deep down, you know that many people don't do this. This is why developers of emulators have to walk on eggshells when they discuss the purpose of their software. Fortunately, I don't think I see anything happening to unofficial emulation anytime soon. Sure, there was a bit of a scare when Valve notified Nintendo about Dolphin coming to Steam, but nothing has really come of that ever since, and Dolphin still uses the Wii common key. For Nintendo to prove that Dolphin is illegal, they would have to argue that its primary function is to circumvent protection. That's not entirely impossible, but Nintendo is sure fighting somewhat of an uphill battle there. They could financially potentially cripple the Dolphin team out of spite if they wanted to, but they also don't want to be setting new legal precedents for emulation that they don't want. Basically, it's in the best interest of both parties to avoid bringing that to court. And just to clarify, the reason why Nintendo would have a hard time proving that Dolphin is primarily used to circumvent protection is that only a tiny fraction of its code is actually related to that. It's also worth noting that GameCube games aren't even protected, and that Dolphin can be, and is used for the development of homebrew titles. For the record, I'm not a lawyer at all, but I have done extensive reading on this particular topic. You can go to Dolphin's website to read more about this. They consulted lawyers for their explanation. So, I don't actually think emulators are in too much legal danger. It's probably best for everyone involved, including large companies, if it remains a legally gray area. However, it would be nice if emulation was normalized. In many ways it is, but there is still very much of a stigma around it. Ideally, publishers would simply sell their ROMs for people to download. As a certain Valve guy said, piracy is a service problem. If downloading ROMs legitimately was an option, lots of people would probably choose that option. So, why don't more companies do this? Well, believe it or not, there actually is an example of this. On Steam, it is possible to purchase very cheap individual ROMs for classic Sega Genesis games. Yes, these ROMs will work with any emulator of your choice, and they're perfectly legal because Sega themselves are selling them. However, by looking at these releases, we can also find a hint as to why this doesn't happen more often. At one point in time, the ROMs of the original Sonic the Hedgehog trilogy were available to purchase, and yes, you could get these for very cheap. However, didn't a certain compilation of classic Sonic games release not too long ago? Oh yes, that's right, Sonic Origins exists, and is considerably more expensive than the previously available ROMs of the games. They didn't pull those off the storefront by accident. You've probably already figured it out, but in case you haven't, having those ROMs available puts the value of Sonic Origins into question. For many people, the value of that compilation is already questionable, but if these ROMs could still be purchased, it would make the value proposition of Sonic Origins seem even less appealing. This is likely why most companies don't just have their old ROMs ready to be purchased at any time. When you pay for a remaster of an old title, you're not just paying for the title itself, but all the work done to, well, remaster it. Additionally, companies are likely going to want to charge as much as they can get away with. If a re-release is subpar, of course having access to a cheaper ROM of the original game with no DRM attached would likely be preferable. This problem can simply be avoided by not having ROMs available to purchase whenever. There's a reason why Super Mario 3D All-Stars was only sold for a limited time. The forced scarcity helped increase the demand for the compilation and ensured that it would never decrease in value. This is important because whenever Nintendo is going to release these titles again on another platform, they still retain much control over the demand for these titles and how much they can charge for them. It's much easier money for them to make than if they were to always have these titles available to purchase for $15 to $20 each. Would I prefer if ROMs were easily available to purchase? Absolutely. It would be a massive victory for game preservation. However, do I think these business models will change anytime soon? Absolutely not. The only way I could see the situation changing is through legislation. As of now, there's simply not enough incentive to have old games readily available to purchase. So, I don't think emulation is in any real danger for the foreseeable future. However, I also don't believe that emulation will be fully normalized anytime soon either. It's probably going to keep staying in the legal gray area it has been stuck in for years. But perhaps it's better that way. For all we know, new legal precedents could put emulation in a very dangerous position. Unfortunately, game preservation is a much more complicated topic than I think most of us want it to be. In a world where retro gaming is far more expensive than it should be, it's really a shame that more isn't being done to make old titles more accessible. No one should have to pay over $100 to experience Armored Core 4 Answer. Ideally, older titles should be readily available to play for anyone who owns a machine that can run games, but we do not live in that ideal world as of now. That about wraps up this video. If you enjoy listening to me talk about video games, I suggest you subscribe and hit the bell icon. I've been playing some Tekken 8 recently, so you might see a video on it soon. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you all have a great day.